August 9th, 48 BC, the plain of Pharsalus, Greece. On one side of the field, 22,000 exhausted legionaries of Julius Caesar, hungry, cut off from supply. On the other, more than 45,000 soldiers of Pompey the Great, backed by a fleet, the treasury of the entire Eastern Empire, and the blessing of the Senate. Caesar was outnumbered more than 2-1. If he lost this battle, Rome would remember him not as a general, but as a traitor. If he won, the republic that had stood for nearly 500 years would die alongside Pompey on this field. The worst part wasn't the numbers, the worst part was who stood on the other side. Pompey the Great was not a stranger's enemy. He had once been Caesar's son-in-law. The two men had once shared power over all of Rome and sworn that neither would ever raise a sword against the other. Now one of them had to die. In this video, we're breaking down how the alliance between the two most powerful men in Rome turned into a civil war that destroyed the Republic, and why a smaller, faster army crushed a force that had everything on its side except time. An alliance of the doomed. To understand Pharsalus, you have to go back 11 years earlier to 60 BC, when three of the most powerful men in Rome struck a deal later known as the First Triumvirate. Gaius Julius Caesar, an ambitious politician with brilliant rhetoric and almost no military record. Gnaeus Pompey the Great, the most successful general of his generation, a man who had already celebrated 3 triumphs when Caesar didn't yet have the legions for even one. And Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, whose money financed both of his partners' ambitions. This was not an alliance of friends. It was an alliance of necessity. None of the three could overcome the Senate alone, so they agreed not to stand in each other's way. The pact was sealed with marriage. Pompey married Julia, Caesar's only daughter. By contemporary accounts, the marriage turned out to be more than political. Pompey was genuinely devoted to his young wife, and as long as Julia lived, the alliance held together on something sturdier than paper. Then the triumvirate began to unravel on its own. In 54 BC, Julia died in childbirth. The personal bond restraining the two most ambitious men in Rome disappeared with her. A year later, Crassus, the third pillar of the alliance, led an army against Parthia and died in the disaster at Carrhae along with most of his force. Only 2 partners remained, and no reason left to keep sharing power. The Senate, which had feared Caesar's growing strength in Gaul for years, saw its opening. The Optimates, the conservative aristocratic faction, drew closer to Pompey, offering him something Caesar could never give: legitimacy in the name of the Republic. In 52 BC, Pompey was appointed sole consul, an unprecedented concentration of power previously granted only to dictators in times of crisis. For Caesar, the Senate prepared the opposite fate: a demand to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, without legions, without immunity, without protection from the trial that had long been waiting for him. For Caesar, this was not a legal formality. It was a trap. Disbanding his army meant handing himself over to his enemies in the Senate. Refusing meant declaring war on the state. On January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar led his legion across the Rubicon River, the boundary no general was permitted to cross under arms without the Senate's explicit consent. He chose war. Anatomy of 2 armies. What followed is hard to understand by looking at troop numbers alone. On paper, Pompey held the overwhelming advantage. Legions across Spain, Africa, and the East answered to him. His fleet controlled nearly the entire Mediterranean. The treasury of the eastern provinces could finance any campaign he wished to run. And most importantly, he had the Senate's legitimacy behind him. In his own eyes and in the eyes of most Romans, Pompey was defending the law, and Caesar was the insurrectionist. But beneath those numbers lay a fundamental weakness. Pompey's army was a coalition, not a machine. A large share of his infantry consisted of freshly levied recruits or legions transferred in from other theaters that had not yet learned to fight as a single unit under his command. And critically, Pompey was not a sole commander. He was surrounded by a camp of optimate senators, each with his own ambitions, his own vision of the war, and his own voice in the war council. Pompey constantly had to reconcile decisions with men who often understood politics better than tactics, and who suspected that a Pompeian victory could make Pompey himself as much of a tyrant as a Caesarian one. Caesar had the opposite structure. His legions, veterans of 8 years of the Gallic Wars, were loyal to him personally, not to some abstract idea of the Republic. They saw him not as a politician, but as the commander who had shared hunger, marches, and plunder with them. Command was vertical and fast. Caesar decided, the army executed. Where Pompey needed a council, Caesar needed only an order. This asymmetry, a slow, negotiated force against a fast, centralized will, shaped the character of the entire war before the first battle was even fought. 3 trials Ilerda. The first major trial took place not in Greece but in Spain in the summer of 49 BC. Rather than pursue Pompey, who had withdrawn east, Caesar first marched against Pompey's legates Afranius and Petreius, who held Spain. At Ilerda, Caesar wasn't looking for a pitched battle. He was looking for a way to cut the enemy off from water, food, and any route of retreat, damming a river and building crossings where his opponents least expected them. After several weeks of maneuvering with almost no bloodshed, both legates surrendered. Dyrrhachium. The second trial nearly proved fatal. In early 48 BC, Caesar brought his army across to Greece and tried to encircle Pompey's camp at Dyrrhachium with a system of earthworks, a technique he had honed to near perfection. But this time the advantage wasn't his. Pompey controlled the sea, and therefore supply, and could build his own fortifications faster than Caesar could seal them off. In July, Pompey's forces broke through Caesar's lines in several places at once. Caesar's army retreated in disarray, losing around 1,000 men. Caesar himself later admitted that if Pompey had pursued the retreat with full determination that day, the war might have ended right there. But Pompey hesitated, and in doing so gave Caesar the time he desperately needed. Pharsalus. The third trial was decisive. After Dyrrhachium, Pompey, pressured by senators in his own camp who demanded an immediate victory and accused him of indecisiveness, agreed to a pitched battle sooner than he himself thought wise. On August 9th, 48 BC, the two armies met on the plain near Pharsalus. Pompey held superior cavalry and planned to use it to swing around Caesar's right flank and strike from behind. Caesar anticipated the move. He hit a reserve infantry unit behind his third line with orders not to throw their javelins from a distance but to strike the enemy cavalry in the face at close range, a tactic built on the assumption that young aristocratic horsemen would fear facial wounds more than seasoned legionaries feared combat itself. The gamble paid off. Pompey's cavalry scattered, Caesar's hidden reserve struck the exposed flank, and Pompey's line broke. By evening, the battle was decided. Why Caesar's system won? The 3 trials, Ilerda, Dyrrhachium, Pharsalus, demonstrate the same principle at different scales. Caesar's victory wasn't a victory of better weapons or braver individual soldiers. It was a victory of a better decision-making structure. For Pompey, every important decision passed through a filter of compromise. The senators in his camp argued over strategy as fiercely as they once had in Rome itself, and ultimately pushed him into the pitched battle at Pharsalus at the exact moment he most needed time, not haste. It's a pattern echoed by other coalitions throughout ancient warfare. No matter how numerous, a coalition loses combat effectiveness once it lacks a single center of decision-making. Caesar, by contrast, had one mind making every decision and one will executing it. When he lost at Dyrrhachium, his army withdrew in order, not in panic. When he spotted a weakness in his opponent's disposition at Pharsalus, he could rebuild his entire battle plan overnight without asking any council's permission. Speed of decision became for Caesar what earthworks had been at other sieges, a mechanism that converted numerical weakness into structural advantage. There's another layer to this victory, a personal one. Caesar's legions fought for a man they knew personally, with whom they had shared the campaigns in Gaul. Pompey's legions fought largely for an abstraction, for the Republic, for the Senate, for a legality whose very definition was under dispute that winter. When the moment of highest tension on the battlefield arrived, that difference in motivation proved just as decisive as the difference in command. Blueprint of a new power. After Pharsalus, Pompey fled by sea to Egypt, hoping for refuge at the court of the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII. Instead of refuge, he found betrayal. The pharaoh's advisors, eager to curry favor with the victor, ordered him killed the moment he stepped ashore. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later, he was presented with the severed head of his former ally and son-in-law. According to ancient accounts, he did not celebrate. He turned away and ordered Pompey buried with honors. The civil war didn't end entirely there. Pockets of resistance continued for several more years in Africa and Spain. But Pharsalus broke the back of any force capable of seriously challenging Caesar. He returned to Rome as dictator, first temporary, then for life, until he himself was killed by his own senators in 44 BC. But the republic he and Pompey had defeated together that August day at Pharsalus never returned to its former shape. What began as a personal duel between two allies ended in the birth of an empire. The story of Caesar against Pompey is, in the end, a story about what happens when structure beats scale. Pompey had more legions, more ships, more money, and the law on his side. Caesar had something else, an army that operated as a single organism, and a will that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. And when the decisive clash finally came, the second proved more important than the first. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the rivalry that buried the Roman Republic, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments. Could Pompey have avoided this defeat at all? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.